Hi, it's Mai here with my 2019 reading stats. So in 2019 I read 146 things, so books and comics, and my original Goodreads goal was 70, so I smashed it. I also read the most number of pages I've read since I've been on Goodreads and tracking that. I read 29,492 pages. Most of what I read were between 100 and 200 pages, like last year, so I read mostly like comics and novellas. And I also listened to 28 hours of audio, which is, I guess, a new record for me. I haven't tracked it, but I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks. I listened to Blameless by Gail Carriger, Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand, and Rolling in the Deep by Myra Grant. The shortest book I read was The Thing About Ghost Stories by Naomi Kritzer, which was a Hugo nominee in one of the short fiction categories, and that was 22 pages. And the longest book I read was Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, which was 602 pages. Goodreads also told me that the most popular book I read was The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. It was a reread for me. A bit under 300,000 people have also read that one. And the least popular book that I read was Phantomland 4 by Maria Laurinen. So this physical chapter of a webcomic, 6 people also have marked this as read on Goodreads. The book that is the highest rated on Goodreads that I read last year was Yotsuba Volume 14 by Kiyohiko Azuma, and this one has a 4.5 average and I gave it 4 stars. I love Yotsuba. It is a very funny manga series. I always give the books 4 or 5 stars when I read them. They just make me happy, they make me laugh out loud. And my average rating for the year was 3.3 stars, which is the same as it was in 2018. Now let's move on to some specific numbers and percents and stats. And for this I'd like to thank Brock from Let's Read for the Google Sheet, which I use to track all of my reading, and at the end of the year it gives me all of these lovely stats. Out of the 146 things that I read 69 graphic works, so those were comic trades, graphic novels and graphic shorts. I read 45 novels, 17 novellas, 6 collections, so those are short story collections from one author, and this is a lot for me. I also read 5 novelettes, those were the Hugo nominees, I missed one nominee. And then I read 4 anthologies, which are, anthologies from multiple authors, and I also counted some short story magazines that I read as anthologies. So 47% of everything that I read was graphic novels and comics. Last year it was 58%. So I'm a bit happier with this. I read some more novels in 2019 than in 2018. So out of 69 comics that I read, only 28 of those were comics that I actually owned, most of them digitally, and the rest of the comics I got from the library. I read 77 things that were not comics, so that was pretty close to my original 70 book Goodreads goal. If you take all the comics out, I still met my goal. Now let's take a look at some specific things. First is the top 3 places where I got the books I read in 2019. I got 46% of my books from the library. I got 9% from Amazon, and that is because I own a Kindle, so those were Kindle books. And tied on the 3rd place with 8% each is Comixology, which I know is also owned by Amazon. And the other 8% is if I count together all the brick and mortar stores where I bought books. So those 46% of library books were 66 things out of everything that I read came from the library. Even though I was doing my Reads and Receipts project, you can see that I didn't really abide to my library rules, especially when it came to comics. I just borrowed a lot of stuff. That's pretty much the same library use stat as I had in 2018. Then the top 3 publishers that I read from. On number 1 with 10% is Image Comics. Then on number 2 with 8% is self-published, which was a surprise for me too. So a lot of those are self-published comics, and then the rest are by T. Kingfisher, Stephanie Burgess and Gail Carriger. And on the 3rd place, tied again with 6%, are Like and Kodansha. Those are a Finnish and an American comic publisher. That is mostly because I read one series from each. I read Luupäät or Bone in Finnish from Like, and I read Tokyo Tarareba Girls from Kodansha Comics. Then we're moving on to genres. 46% of what I read was fantasy, surprising no one. 17% was science fiction, that I think is up from 2018. 40% was horror. 8% was contemporary. That is mostly comics, I think. 3% was mystery or crime, probably Poirot novels. 3% was a speculative fiction mix. That is what I put collections under. So if I read, for example, a short story collection from N.K. Jemisin, this one has science fiction and fantasy stories, so this is the speculative fiction mix. Then 3% were fairy tales and 2% were superheroes. The rest is 4%, and those were 2 romance books, 2 historical fiction books, 1 comedy, 1 non-fiction, and 1 classic. I tend to put classics under their genre. So, for example, if I read a horror classic, I put it under horror. I only put a book under the general classics label if I can't come up with another genre easily. The age group of books I read was 77% adult. Then, as a bit of a surprise, is 12% middle grade, but that is mostly because I read the whole Bone series by Jeff Smith. And then 10% YA and 1% kids. The languages I read 88% in English and 12% in Finnish. Again, most of that was the Bone comics in Finnish, but also some other comics and manga, because manga is translated. It doesn't matter if I read it in English or Finnish, it's not in the original language in any case. So if it is available in Finnish, I most often read it in Finnish. As to the books that I acquired in 2019, I acquired 75 things. So those are physical books, ebooks, and comics, and I read 41% of those. Compared to 2018, in 2019 I actually bought 10 books less and I read more of the books that I bought. In 2018 that stat was 34% and now it is 41%, so it's up a bit. As to the ages of the books that I read mostly books published in 2018 because I don't usually read new titles when they are published. I usually get to them the year after. So I read 33 books, or 23% of my reading was published in 2018. And I mostly read stuff published between 2015 and 2019. That is 98 books. I read 17 books from the other years of 2000, so from 2000 to 2014. Then I read 11 books from the 90s. In 2018, I actually read nothing from the 90s. I also read 6 books from the 70s, then 13 books from other decades of the 1900s, and 1 book from the 1800s. Now let's look at the stats about some of the authors that I read. So author gender is first. I read 62% from women. I read 28% from men, 5.5% was both, so that is teams of men and women, mostly in comics, mostly comic book teams like a writer and artist, and then 3.5% is unknown and 1% were non-binary authors. Then there is the country of the author, 49% were from the US, 16% were from Japan, 12% from the UK, 5% from Finland, 5% from various. I put anthologies with people all around the world writing in them under various. And then there's 3% from Canada, 3% from UK and US. So this again, a comic theme thing. There were a few of those, so I put it under its own category. And then the rest, or the 7% that is left, are 2 books from New Zealand, 2 from Ireland, 1 from Singapore, 1 from France, 1 from Malaysia, and 1 from Colombia. Then just to follow my own reading tendencies, I made a very loose white person, person of color category for my authors. And that said that I read 62% from white authors and 27% from authors of color. 8% were teams, so like comic book teams, and 3% were unknown. So my reading was 62% white. In 2018, it was 51.5% white. So I read 10% less from authors of color in 2019, which isn't that great. And finally, let's look at my reading in accordance to month. So which was my best reading month and which was my worst, according to the pages and book numbers, not according to ratings. My best reading month in both the amount of books and the amount of pages was June. I read 17 books and 3,717 pages. My worst reading months were February with 6 books and page-wise August with 1,020 pages. This one was the Worldcon and renovation move month, so no surprise there. So that is all from my 2019 reading stats. I hope you enjoyed watching that, and I'll see you in my next video.